So today I want to start off by discussing Jehovah's Witnesses and sex. Now it's quite a sensitive and difficult topic to address really within the organisation, because Jehovah's Witnesses from day one are exposed to constantly negative and discouraging propaganda about sex. Sex is mostly referred to in a negative way, and they talk about premarital or extramarital sex as literally the worst sin you can do against your own body. It's the worst sin you can do, full stop, apart from blasphemy against God himself, because of a scripture they use that does say it's against your own body. And I always thought the application of the scripture was a bit odd, because sex in itself is not a defiling act if it's consensual. It's quite enjoyable. Scientifically, it's proven to generate a good immunity in human beings. It makes you feel better. It binds you to the person that you're having sex with, and all these kind of good things. So sex in itself is not bad. However, the Jehovah's Witnesses only refer to sex, well, normally refer to sex anyway, as a negative thing. And all of the propaganda they use about sex is highly discouraging. It really is depressing reading these articles about sex. It really is. In the Young People Ask book, there are quotes nearly always or completely exclusively by females, sisters. And again, that reinforces the idea that women are always used and abused in sex, that they merely endure sex, they don't enjoy it. It's always a negative experiences for females. Not so much for males, they're not even sort of mentioned, but for females, their experiences are overwhelmingly negative. And these sisters quote such things as, when I had sex outside of marriage as a teenager, when I left the truth, I always felt dirty. I felt used and abused. My boyfriend had sex with me, but he didn't marry me. In the end, he dumped me and went off with somebody else. And I always felt dirty for letting him use my body. There you go, that kind of language again, letting a man use me. As if females don't have a real part in sex, they're just there to be used. The female just lies there motionless while the male uses her, and then he's had his pleasure and he leaves. The woman is never really assigned that view that she enjoys sex. It's always the opposite. She just merely endures it. And the females are always portrayed as feeling disillusioned and shocked when the man that they were having sex with, or the boy they were having sex with, doesn't marry them. And that in itself reinforces the idea that women only have sex with men for financial security, for marital security, and to produce children and babies. That the notion that a woman can just have sex just for sex and do it with a person that she doesn't really care that much about and is happy to forget afterwards is not even considered. That is purely a male attribute, not a female. They only want to have sex for the emotional support and for financial support and to have a child. Therefore, these sisters who their experiences that are used are always portrayed as feeling betrayal and shock and depression and guilt when the person they have sex with basically says, I was just doing it for fun. That your expectation of marriage and love as a result of sex, was just a load of rubbish. But this is the thing, the Jehovah's Witnesses, they continuously lump good sex and love together. Extramarital sex is always bad. No love can come from it. Only love within the Christian arrangement with a good brother who's a good pioneer and all the rest of it can result in genuine love. Anything else is just fake. And therefore, sisters, don't be surprised when you have sex with worldly men and they just leave you and dump you. As if Jehovah's Witness husbands don't do the same thing, routinely. They portray Christian men as the very best they could ever hope for. Christian men would never abuse or rape you. Christian men would never cheat on you. Christian men would look after you and provide for the family. They would be loyal with you. They would support your spiritual side. The funny thing is, when Christian men turn out most of the time to be very abusive, controlling, they get really angry if a Christian woman tries to be independent in any way. They reinforce the idea that women are submissive, they are the weakest sex, that all those kind of things are not even acknowledged when making these kind of statements. The society stance is A Christian husband is the absolute ideal. A worldly husband is going to always lead into disaster. Therefore, to stay away from them is all about the greater good, is our concern for you. We want you to marry a nice man who will look after you. Well, my mother, for example, she dated my father, who's also a witness. My mother was 17. My dad was 26. He was 9 years older than my mum. And my dad came from a bad background. My dad had a bad attitude. He was quite a violent, nasty, mean person. But my mom came from a very abusive family. Her mother and father divorced or separated, I think. I think they were separated. They couldn't get a divorce because of the scriptural side. They were separated. My mother's dad, even though he was a witness, he wanted nothing to do with helping the children or my grandmother. He often blamed her and he said, "You should leave and take that lot with you." My grandfather was never brought to task for this by the elders. He was allowed to do what he wanted and flirt with sisters and be a flirt, and that was okay. My nan was left to struggle with 5 children, and my mother was left to look after her baby brother, and in the end she was desperate to leave the situation, and along come my dad. Along he came, and they dated very briefly, and my mother told me it was all exactly by the book. They went nowhere without a chaperone. She asked him all the questions you're supposed to ask. How regular are you on the ministry? What does the congregation think of you? Do you go to the meetings regularly? Does he answer up? And all these things. The congregation, she went to them and she said, what kind of brother is he? What's his reputation? And of course everybody gave him blinding reviews. Oh, he's a great brother. You're lucky to have him, blah, blah, blah. So they dated. Then they got married and my mother was 18 and my dad was 27. And she told me that before they even got to the plane for the honeymoon, the abuse began. My dad was not at all interested in my mother, in her thoughts, her beliefs, her feelings, or anything like that. He treated her like dirt from that moment. She said the honeymoon was a complete disaster and she felt stressed out and depressed from day one. She realized it was a huge mistake. And when you're in that position, you can do nothing but just carry on with it because you have no other option. Either you do that or you go insane. So my mother chose to go insane slowly by accepting it, which is very sad. But this is the problem. Christian men and women and boys and girls are taught that sex can only happen within the marriage arrangement. And this is the result, which I've seen many, many times, and I'm sure everyone listening who is Jehovah's Witness or knows people who've been to congregations, I'm sure you've seen at least one case or heard of one case of this. What happens is Jehovah's Witness children are told that the only place they can have sex is within a marital arrangement. Therefore, when they get to puberty and they start to have sexual urges and they can't masturbate because masturbation is a sin and dirty and you're supposed to confess and all the rest of it, they start to get desperate. They go to school. They see their classmates dating. They hear of sexual stories and they get desperate. They feel frustrated. Maybe they look around and think, oh, I can't wait till I'm 30 to get married like brother or sister so-and-so. There's a brother over there, he's 50 and he's still not married. Does that mean he hasn't had sex in 50 years? Dear me, that's terrible. So what they do is they get desperate. And they start to search the congregations, or maybe they just look in their own, for someone who's sort of a similar age, who's the opposite gender, who seems to be okay. And what happens is they convince themselves they are suddenly falling madly in love with this brother or sister. And it's like a whirlwind romance. And the worst part of it is the congregation encourage it. Because deep down, everyone is thinking, we would rather have them marry and have sex quickly within marriage than have them frustrated and then look elsewhere in the world and end up sinning and being disfellowshipped. So we'd rather them just get married now. And besides, if they get married in the truth, what's the worst that can happen? Even if they're not suited well, we're encouraged to make it work. They can make it work. Of course, when it's not to your life and your problem, it's easy to give stupid advice like that to young people and to be very, like, oh, I don't care, and very free with advice. Because one thing that Jehovah's Witnesses are very, very good at is telling you how to live your life, and at the same time having that little disclaimer that we are not responsible for any of the bad things that may happen if you follow our advice. So, for example, let's say that you have a sister, and she marries a young man very, very quickly because the congregation encouraged her to do so. He's a good pioneer. He's talked about going to Bethel. And of course, that's all that matters. A person's personality or, your sexuality or your chemistry or anything like that, that's not important. You can make that up as you go along. The things that are really important that qualify you as a good mate, according to Jehovah's Witnesses, is, are you a pioneer? Are you at least regular on the ministry? Do you make meaningful comments? Do you study up regularly? Do you go to meetings regularly? Are you good association? Do you have good Christian goals? Are you staying away from college and university and things like that? So, are you a good Christian? If the answer is yes, then the green light is on and the marriage can happen. Now, let's say the sister marries her brother. She knows nothing about him really. She's never even been with him alone because it's all chaperoned and group activities, and she's been monitored and watched by the congregation and her family and parents all the time. She gets married to him. Now that brother has been taught his whole life that women are the weakest sex. They are easily swayed and deceived because Eve was the one that Satan picked on, and she was so stupid and naive that she basically was the downfall of all of mankind. That Adam could have said, well, I reject Eve, Jehovah, destroy her and give me a new wife, and things could have carried on. But Eve was so stupid and manipulative that she was the one who tricked Adam, and the next thing you know, we're all in sin. So men view women like that in the truth. They can deny it, but sadly it's true. Women are always seen as gossipers, as troublemakers, as idle. They're untrustworthy, they're emotional. A brother is always more trustworthy than a sister, always. And it's very sad, but they pretend like it's not real, but it is. And when it really counts, these attitudes come out. So let's say that this sister marries the brother. And then because he's been taught these things, and also the scripture that is always repeated when it comes to sex and marital sex, which is negative, about giving your husband or wife their due. Now that is something you only say to couples who aren't doing it. To couples who don't want to have sex, or to a particular partner who doesn't want to have sex with their husband or wife. And as usual, that scripture is always really directed at sisters more because of that old stereotype that women endure sex and men enjoy it. Therefore, the wives will say, we don't want to have sex anymore, I'm bored of it now. And husbands are there frustrated and desperate, so they have to tell the elders to bully their wife into submitting to sex. So this young sister marries a brother, and he thinks that his due should come from her, and he rapes her several times. In fact, every sexual encounter they have is either under duress or it's just plain old rape. And because he's been told that he's due that sexual pleasure and that she is his wife and he's the head and she's submissive and she has to be a good Christian wife, that he doesn't even view it as rape. And so therefore she's not allowed to view it as rape. Now all this comes from not knowing what somebody is actually like sexually. A person in bed is very, very different from the person they are just in ordinary company. Of course they are. Some people are very sensitive when it comes to sex. Some people have had bad sexual experiences in the past and that affects their current sexuality. But you'd never know that unless you're in that situation. Some people are very selfish in sex and they just want to get their pleasure and then they finish. That's very bad. But sadly, these kind of things you can only find out once you're in the marital bed on the honeymoon or whenever it is you first have sex. And if by then you realise that your husband or your wife is a selfish or inconsiderate sexual partner, they don't really care about you, they just think it's okay to use you for their pleasure and then say, okay, it's done now, over now, let's go to sleep. Or when it comes to having a baby, if your husband says, I want to have a child right away, and the wife said, well, I don't really want to, the husband may say, it's not your choice. I'm going to still have sex with you without a condom because we don't need them now that we're married. And you can't take the morning after pill because it's abortive, apparently. And you can't take any other kind of contraception because I don't want you to. I'm the head. Well, that sister can do absolutely nothing about it because the Jehovah's Witnesses do not view sexual abuse, rape, beatings, any other kind of abuse in a marriage, isolation, not having money given to you, not being able to see friends and family or drive a car. They don't see these as actual good, valid reasons for having a scriptural divorce. The only thing you can do with a divorce is adultery. So you have to wait, and then you have to prove to 3 men that your husband has committed adultery. And if those 3 men are good friends with your husband, and maybe he's an elder or something, then they may be very, very reluctant to actually take you seriously. And again, women are seen as untrustworthy, as deceivers, as, gossipers and all these things. So they would rather your husband tell them that you are lying, and then they'll just believe that straight away. Of course you're lying. The brother is more trustworthy, even though he's the one being accused. And that's the sad fact. But I see this all the time. And I always lament and I feel panic when I see these young witness boys and girls, teenagers, desperate to get married. They're trying to marry the first person they date, and that is also seriously an issue because the Jehovah's Witnesses strongly discourage dating without a view to marriage. If you do that, you can actually get disfellowshipped if people know that you routinely date people without the view of getting married, because they say that's unscriptural. If you date somebody, you have to be determined from day one, from the minute you become a couple, that you want to marry this person. How can you do that when you barely know somebody? The whole dating process is to get to know somebody on a more intimate level, with your cards on the table saying, I have a crush on you, or I love you, or I fancy you, or whatever. But you shouldn't commit and say, yeah, well, we should get married then, from day one. I mean, for goodness sake, who does that? That's ridiculous. That's like going to a job interview and saying from the very, very first moment that you step in the door, this is the only place I ever want to work ever. I know nothing about the job. I don't know what the pay is. I don't know what the office is like or what the gym is like or wherever you want to work. But I've made up my mind already. I want to work there. If my colleagues are horrible, well, tough. I've signed the contract now. If I feel like I want to kill myself after 1 week of working here, tough. I've already signed the contract before I knew anything about it. How stupid. How absolutely stupid. And yet Jehovah's Witness men and women, boys and girls, are told that this is the only way that you can find a mate. And so these young Christian men and women, boys and girls, are going out, they're trying to marry the very first person they date. And in the end, they get married. In my congregation, there was a boy who was my age, and at the time he was 21. He was 21, and for his age, he was quite immature. He wasn't very well liked. During high school, because I went to the same high school as him, he was known for being a flirt. I think he got reproved before. He was quite a worldly boy, in that sense. He lived quite a double life. And I knew that, and it caused me a lot of trouble because my schoolmates would come to me and say, hey, how come you can't do such and such? Because Jay over there, he can. Names have been changed, by the way, just disclaimer. But they'll say, hey, Jay can do it, but you can't. I thought that Jehovah's Witnesses couldn't swear, but Jay does, so how come you can't swear? It caused a lot of problems. But then by the time he was 21, the elders overlooked all this nonsense, and he kind of straightened up and flew right for about a year or so. And then, of course, he began looking around to date. And he found this girl from another congregation, and she was only 18. Well, by the time she was married, she was 18, so they started dating before that. And even though he was in his 20s and she was a teenager, it didn't seem to matter. And she also, for her age, was very, very exceptionally immature. She was very flighty. She kind of looked at life like she was a Disney princess, and this was like, all fun and games, and nothing was bad, and, her mom and dad are very nice, and she sort of just had like a very cushiony childhood and upbringing. And she met Jay from my hall, and I tell you, he was one of the most unattractive men you've ever seen in your life. He was described, not just by me, he looked like all of the Beatles from the band mixed together as one person. As a child, his nickname was Rockhead, because his head was of such a weird shape. He was deeply unattractive. And yet this woman from another congregation who was like, well, she wasn't even a woman at the time, she was a child, she was a teenager, so she was a girl. She was very, very pretty, as they always are. This is another thing you see in congregations. You see very attractive sisters with very mediocre or even completely ugly brothers. And it's a desperation of, I need someone to have sex with, I need anybody, because otherwise I'm going to burst. And so this girl, let's call her Kay, she got married to Jay when she was 18 and he was 21. And the wedding was completely a big fat joke. When we got there, because I was invited with my family, everything was overseen and conducted by teenagers and people who were like the age of 21 and under, because it was like their friends who were the ushers and the bridesmaids and the tenants for this thing. And all the grown-ups kind of filed in and looked a bit out of place, like they didn't know where to sit or what to do, because they're used to taking the responsibility in weddings. But for this time, they were sitting on the bench while the kids were running the show. And it felt very much like a kid's party. That's what it felt like. And it just felt like a complete joke of marriage. And this is a problem, you see. It was very obvious to people like me that the main reason that these teenagers and young people get married to the first person they date is quite simple. They're bursting to have sex, and the only way they can do that without being disfellowshipped or reproved or having the guilt or feeling like they have to hide it or their guilty conscience is killing them is by simply getting married. And all they think is, well, the worst thing that can happen is we're not 100% suited, but don't worry, we'll sort it out. We're both Christians, Jehovah will help us. But that is not reality. The thing with sex with Jehovah's Witnesses is talked about in such a negative way that people are absolutely terrified of sex completely. They're completely terrified. And when it comes to actually having sex, like I said, they would prefer to marry the first witness and jump into bed with them than actually do any other option. That's the only option they have, so they do that. And even then, I can't imagine what Christian men and women, especially the women sadly, are like on their first night. Because it's like, it's always been spoken of in a negative way. And when something is spoken of always in a negative way, when you finally reach that point where you are allowed to do it, you finally have permission because of this one rare exception, because you're married now, it can be very, very difficult to shift that perception that sex is bad. It can be very difficult to have sex and feel like it was okay, like you don't have to be guilty this time because you were doing it because you're allowed to now. You're married. You don't have to confess. I've heard actual sisters tell me that after they had sex for the first time on their honeymoons or whatever, they felt an overwhelming urge to tell the elders that they'd sinned, even though they knew they hadn't. But they said even though they knew they were allowed to do this, that they'd been sort of trying to mentally prepare themselves for this, they felt like the instinct was to confess to the elders straight away that they'd had sex, because it had been drummed into their heads since they were old enough to read and write and understand what was being said at the Kingdom Halls, that sex was a negative, bad sin. And even though they had permission now, they felt like they couldn't get rid of that stigma that sex was bad. And they said it actually took a long time for them to get over that and just accept that they were allowed to do it now, and it wasn't a big deal. They didn't have to confess to anybody or get punished. They were allowed to do it. And to me, that is absolutely a terrible thing. It is an indication that the way that Jehovah's Witnesses talk about sex, the way they present it, the way that they brainwash people into accepting these ideas is absolutely immoral and against everything that Jehovah and Jesus stands for. Jehovah created men and women to be compatible. He could have created us so that we reproduce on our own like certain animals and organisms do, but he didn't. Both men and women can feel pleasure during sex. In fact, a woman's clitoris is about 1,000 times more sensitive than a man's penis, but that is never really addressed. It's just ignored. Men, by tradition, enjoy sex. Women endure it. Their reward is a baby. Therefore, if you are barren and you can't have kids, it is the greatest curse a woman can ever experience. Because that means, in effect, she's been enduring this sex for years for nothing. She has gained nothing from it, and now she feels humiliated and despaired and probably used and abused again. And that's such a terrible thing. It's such a terrible thing to brainwash young people into believing that pre- or extramarital sex is always a terrible thing. These witnesses who give their fake... I mean, who knows whether these quotes really come from real witnesses? Nobody knows. The writing team could make these up. They could ask a sister about her experiences, and they deliberately pick on a sister who had terrible ones, and all the ones who could honestly say, well, to be honest, brother, when I had sex outside of marriage, when I was a teenager, or when I grew up before I came into the truth, I never felt guilty. I never felt like I was used or abused. I went into a sexual relationship with all my cards on the table. I said to a young man, I just want to have a one-night stand, or I just want to have casual sex, and afterwards we should split. Let's just have a summer fling. And so when we did that, I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel bad. I felt okay. And other people may say, yeah, we had a relationship and I thought it would be forever, but we broke up. And people do that. It's normal life. And so in the end, I sort of got over it. I had another relationship, and now we're married. And it never ever bothered me. But those experiences are always ignored and censored. Don't tell people that you can have these experiences and be okay. Don't tell people you can have pre or extramarital sex and enjoy it. And this nonsense about STDs and pregnancies, it always is synonymous with pre or extramarital sex. If you have pre or extramarital sex, you will have STDs and STIs and unwanted pregnancies, which of course lead to things like abortions, and it just gets worse and worse. And people have extramarital sex, especially women, because, you know, they're the ones that experience pregnancies and abortions, not men. It will always lead to like trauma for you. The only way you can have non-traumatic sex is with a Christian man. With anyone else, it's going to cause you intense emotional pain. They even use the phrase stabbing themselves all over with many pains. What a graphic image to cement on the idea of pre or extramarital sex, which is completely nonsense. Of course, some people are going to have bad sexual experiences, and you don't even have to be with a non-witness man to have those. How many sisters have told the elders that their husbands rape them? Their husbands belittle them. Their husbands are selfish in bed, and they feel like their relationship is terrible. And the elders just say, oh, well, you should pray harder to be a better Christian wife. Remember the scripture about giving your husband his due, and etc., etc. And that's it. And then they have the cheek to say that pre or extramarital sex or sex with non-witnesses will always result in trauma. Now, when it comes to STDs and all that nonsense, I was terrified of sex because of those things. And then one day it struck me. I thought, how can the body possibly know when it's having marital sex or not? Because by that logic then, several brothers I know in my congregation who I sort of had a crush on or whatever, they had been disfellowshipped in the past. And it suddenly struck me, hang on a sec, what if brother so-and-so had had sex outside of marriage, obviously, when he was disfellowshipped? So what if he picked up an STD? And then he gets reinstated, and I like him, and he likes me back, and we get married. We have sex on our wedding night, and I get the STD. Now, being married didn't protect me from that at all. So, hang on a sec, where does the logic come into this? The body doesn't know when it's having marital sex or not. The body doesn't have a natural, magical defense against these kind of things. That's stupid. And yet it's never addressed within the Watchtower magazines or publications. It's never even acknowledged. It's always associated with premarital sex. The same with unwanted pregnancies. As if all pregnancies within marriage are wanted. But they're not. My own mother was on contraceptives after she had me. And twice they failed. And so she had, instead of one child, which was her desire, just for one. Because her marriage was so bad, she honestly thought that having a baby, as many people do, they think, well, we'll have a baby and that will straighten everything out. He'll love me again because he'll see the child, he'll have intense fatherly love, and then he'll love me because I was the one who produced it. So she had me. Guess what? Didn't work. And so she was on contraceptives afterwards. And they failed, so instead of having one child, she ended up with 3. And the other 2 weren't planned and they weren't necessarily wanted, but tough. And that kind of thing is ignored by the Watchtower Society. They act like all pregnancies that are unwanted act outside of marriage. And that it's almost like an inevitable consequence of having extramarital sex. But it's not. They forget that people can have contraceptives, that they can wear a condom, they can be on the pill or the patch or have the coil or the injection. Some people can have the coil and it lasts for 10 years. And you can't get pregnant with the coil because it's copper and it prevents contraception from happening, or from things from being conceived. It stops it from happening. Yet elders and the Watchtower Society always act as if premarital sex is kind of like between 2 stupid people who wear no protection and therefore expose themselves to all these terrible things, whereas people within marital arrangements are somehow protected. But that's not true. And besides, even with STDs and STIs, whether it occurs within a marriage or outside of a marriage, many of them are treatable. It's not like the end of the world. Okay, if you get AIDS or something like that, which you could get even if you're married, okay, that is quite bad. But something like herpes or whatever, these things are treated. People are born with herpes, and it's like a lottery. If you marry someone who also has a disease and you have sex, it can trigger that disease off and you both start to have the symptoms of it. But before, it was sort of dormant. But of course, that kind of thing is just ignored and not addressed. And the annoying part is, if you bring that up to an elder or to the society, all they say is, well, just because we didn't mention it doesn't mean that we disagree that it's true. But the problem is, you are feeding people information about something that is absolutely important, and it impacts people's lives to a massive degree. It influences people's decisions when it comes to huge things like marriage and things like that. And you are deliberately only showing the bad and negative sides of sex. You are hammering home unlikely situations as if this is the norm. But you decline to show a balanced view of sex. In your minds, a balanced view of sex is marital sex on the good side and everything else on the bad side. But that's not right. You don't even address rape within marriages. You don't address unwanted and accidental pregnancies or diseases caused by sex within marriages. You reserve these only for pre- and extramarital sex. And the purpose of it is obvious. It's not about having or wanting the best for Christian men and women. Because if that were true, they would highlight the dangers of rape and stuff like that and abuse within marriages, and they would have policies intact for dealing with such situations, but they don't. The purpose of these propaganda-filled articles is obvious. They want to scare people away from doing it. And it's like, I remember one person said that Jehovah's Witnesses are living under fog. Fear, obligation, and guilt. And Christian men, and especially sadly again Christian women, are indoctrinated with these practices and teachings which fills them with fear. They are terrified of having pre-extramarital sex because they are afraid not only will they get caught, not only will Jehovah disown them and hate them, not only will the congregation do the same and shun them, not only will they get disfellowshipped, but they will also inevitably catch STDs which will ruin their lives, and they will get pregnant, which again ruins your life apparently. And this way of thinking is absolutely detrimental to people. It scares them from doing it. They're filled with fear. And then comes along the obligation. They feel obliged, therefore, to marry a Christian man or woman, even if they're a terrible partner, even if they're severely unattractive, or they have a bad reputation when it comes to flirting or whatever. It doesn't matter. As long as they are good on the ministry, as long as their card shows that they are a good publisher, that they do the average hours, that they go to the meetings, they dress well, they have good association, all those kind of things, that makes them a good partner. And if someone like that is interested in you, a lot of brothers and especially sisters feel obliged to return the affections, because otherwise, well, they're turning down somebody who's a good match, according to the congregation. And you also feel pressure, because it's a sad fact that because Jehovah's Witnesses don't have much to celebrate, they often use weddings as an excuse to have a good party. And that is why I think a lot of Jehovah's Witnesses are intensely offended when they don't get invited to weddings, because it's almost like they're saying, what, you made me miss my chance to have a good party for once? How dare you? We don't celebrate Christmas, we don't do Easter, we don't have birthdays, Mother's Day, Father's Day, anything. So when you have a big party for the first time in years, and I wasn't invited, that is so mean and unchristian of you. And it's ridiculous. So when people look like they're interested in each other, I find that congregations do get very hands-on and they interfere and they get very pushy, and it's all, oh, if you know, how long have you been dating? Don't you think you should get engaged now and all this stuff? And there's an awful lot of pressure. And people sadly succumb to it because all they think is, well, the people in general want to take the path of least resistance, especially people who feel abused or pressured. They want to take the path of least resistance because that way they get less harassment, less interference, less persecution, and they can just live a quieter life where people just leave them alone. It's better just to go with the flow. than to kick against it and make a fuss, because the second you do that, you become a target for abuse and harassment, and people will spy on you and bully you, and nobody wants to live like that. So it's better just to succumb and say, okay, fine, we'll get married then. If it will please everybody, if everyone thinks it's a good idea and we trust you and your judgment, because why not? Fine, let's get married. So people actually feel obliged to marry somebody for these reasons, as well as, dating people and then just dumping them and moving on is discouraged. And then, of course, comes the guilt. You feel guilty for even wanting to have sex with somebody outside of the truth, or having sex with your partner or whatever inside the truth who you're not married to yet. You feel terribly guilty even for thinking these thoughts. Because, of course, there's a scripture where Jesus says, anyone looking at a woman, or by extension a man, with a passion has already committed adultery with them in their heart. So, of course, you feel terribly guilty, like, oh no, what am I thinking? I remember as a child, I felt so paranoid about sex, and this is a true story. I remember all of a sudden the thought struck me, what if, and I was very young when I thought this as well, what if people can see my thoughts in my eyes? Otherwise, how do they know what you're thinking? And as a child, I honestly had this feeling like, oh my God, what if people could see what you're thinking in your eyes? And straight away, I felt terrified that every time I thought about sex, that people could literally see it happening in my eyes, and I would get told off. And that's a very stupid concept, and it was when I was a child, so don't take it too seriously. But that is how paranoid I was about sexual thoughts. That, oh my God, what if what I'm thinking is projected into my eyes somehow, and people will see? It's that guilt and the fear, and oh my gosh, such a terrible atmosphere when it comes to sex. And it's crazy, because even in the articles and in the Bible translations, the word sex is never used. It's always sexual relations, which is a very, very long and unnecessary phrase. Why don't you say sex? It's almost as if the word itself is offensive, so they have to make it more clinical by saying sexual relations, sexual intercourse, which always makes me feel really queasy, honestly, that phrase, sexual intercourse, and stuff like that. Why doesn't it just say plain sex? Why not? It's almost like the word itself is sort of made to be dirty and taboo. It's got stigma attached to it. You don't want to say the word sex. It's a bad word. So we must sort of cushion it by saying sexual intercourse, sexual relations, and it's so cringy. People don't use that kind of terminology in normal life. Nobody does. People just say sex. It's normal. It should be healthy. It should be just a normal word to describe an action which is either normal or healthy, or it's not, or whatever. But it's just a word. But the society always have to, it's almost like the writer goes to write sex and cringes and thinks, no, I'll write something else. Sexual intercourse, there you go. That makes it less sexy. It's ridiculous. But this is the problem. So I just want to make this podcast or whatever, because this is a kind of topic that is never addressed. People take this kind of thing on face value, and the culture of marrying when you're very young is very much like the culture of getting baptized when you're very young. It's like, it's seen as commendable, it's seen as protecting you from temptation from the world, and it's seen as, how could this go wrong, really? It can't go wrong. You're going to get married or baptized sooner or later. Why not just do it now and get it over with? Then you have the rest of your life to work on it. And it's terrible, it really is. And the fact that they're ruling people by fear, by spreading this propaganda and this negative image of sex, is just ridiculous, and that shouldn't be allowed. Only balanced views should be allowed, where they honestly and in depth explore both sides of it, and then leave you to make your own decision, because that's where free will comes into play. How can it be free will if you are only sold the good parts when it comes to joining the Jehovah's Witnesses, which is what happens. They only talk about the good parts of being a Jehovah's Witness: everlasting life, a relationship with God, a new spiritual family, a spiritual paradise, a spiritual feast, a safe haven. They don't mention the other things. They talk about disfellowshipping as if it's a last resort only for absolutely unrepentant, evil sinners who sit there with their arms folded like in the Watchtower pictures, defying the elders, saying, I don't even want to be a witness. Well, in that case, well, they wouldn't be a witness anyway then. In that case, they would leave anyway, because nobody wants to stay with that attitude. But they don't realise that you can get disfellowship for merely asking the wrong questions or even refusing to answer questions that an elder asks, especially when it comes to sex. With my case, I told them I was very repentant. I was the one who told them that I had done something wrong, even though I'd been raped. I told them that I felt like bad because I wasn't a virgin anymore, and I know that that's important for some reason. So I want to confess. I was hauled into a room, and suddenly I realised this was not just a discussion, this was a judicial committee. There were 3 elders. What's going on? The doors were all locked behind me. And then they launched into a very, very degrading and invasive interrogation, and they wanted to know the man's name. It seemed very, very important to them that they know who it was with whom I had these dirty relationships with. And I said to them, he's not even a witness. He doesn't even live in this country. Why do you want to know? It's not like I'm protecting a fellow witness from his sexual crimes, and therefore I'm obliged to tell them who it is so he can get punished as well. I could understand if it were that way. But he wasn't anything to do with the Jehovah's Witnesses at all. And I think, honestly, that the reason they asked me that question over and over, even when 3 years later I came to be reinstated, they asked me, are you going to answer that question now, finally? What was the man's name? And again, I said very respectfully, I don't think I do want to answer that question. And again, I don't really see why it's necessary. And they couldn't tell me why it was necessary. They could only keep asking me the same question because they want to bully you and pressure you into submitting. And if you don't answer the question, even though it has nothing to do at all with your repentance or anything else, they can actually use that as an excuse to disfellowship you, because they can say, because the sister didn't answer our questions, she was uncooperative, she was unrepentant. Therefore, we can disfellowship her. And to add further weight to that, when I went home that day and I told my mother that I'd been disfellowshipped, she couldn't believe it. She honestly couldn't believe it. She was in total shock, more than I was, because she knew the full details of what happened to me because I told her. And she said to me, you should appeal that sentence. And I said, that's funny because they didn't say anything about appealing it, even though their elders book, which I had, and I knew about it because my dad used to be an elder and I had that book, it says in there that you are supposed to inform the person you disfellowship that they are allowed to appeal. You're supposed to tell them how to do it, and then you're supposed to tell them that they can do it or they don't have to do it. It's up to them. And that's it. They can't tell you to and they can't tell you not to. But with me, the moment they told me I was disfellowshipped, they opened the door and said, you need to leave now because we need to say the prayer. And in my head I thought, what? What happened to the appeals procedure? And so I had to say to the elder, hang on a sec, aren't you supposed to tell me the details about the appeal? And he actually said to me, if I were you, I wouldn't even bother. So even from that moment, I knew they'd made up their mind, because they're the ones who have to be involved again. But anyway, I went home and I decided I was going to do it anyway. So I looked on the internet and I found out how to do it. So I wrote down the letter and everything. And it said in the online and in the book, they're supposed to tell you very clearly the reason that they disfellowshipped you, which they didn't. So I had to text the brother who was in charge of my committee and say to him, I'm writing my appeals letter and I'm supposed to say exactly the reason I was disfellowshipped, but you didn't tell me. So can you just tell me, why? What was the reason? Just quickly say it so I can put it in my letter. And instead of telling me, he actually said, we'll get back to you on that. I still have the text. And you know what? Crazily enough, when I told him that he had said that, he denied it. And then he said to me that he didn't have any text from me at all, even though he'd been corresponding with me via text for a long, long time and had many of them. And I realised that this brother, who was fairly, he's getting on, he probably doesn't understand technology very well, to be honest. I could tell that he had deleted all of our conversation from his phone. And he thought that doing that wiped it from mine as well. And when I realised this, I said to him, you do realise that if you delete somebody's messages from your phone, the other person still has them. And his face, again, I wish I had my Nikon with me, because his face was a picture. His face fell from being kind of smug and arrogant to suddenly like, oh no, I didn't know that. I said, yeah. I said, I have all the texts that you sent me from day one. I have to delete those if you want me to get rid of them. I have to do it from my phone. Deleting them from your phone just wipes all the evidence from your phone, but I still have it. And he had actually stated in those texts that he basically didn't have an answer for me, that he had to go and find out, and they never actually got back to me about that. So I had to assume that they disfellowshipped me for immorality. But in reality, they disfellowshipped me for not answering questions. But of course, he doesn't want to say that in a text because, that's not a good reason. So he wouldn't commit to actually telling me why. Who does that? That is like getting arrested by police. And when you're in handcuffs at the station, you say, what are the charges? And they say, I don't know. We'll get back to you on that in a week. We'll put you in the cell and leave you there. But we don't care. So, we don't even know what you've done to break the law, but we'll let you know sooner or later. You can't do that. You can't do that. And when it comes to, there's like an ex-elder from Bethel and everything, and he said that in a judicial committee, the questions posed to females who have done sexual crimes, as it were, are much, much more hostile and invasive and degrading than those posed to a man. And it was the very same thing for me. They asked me if I were pregnant. And I was a bit like, what? And then I thought to myself, I was trying to reason why they'd said this. And I thought, well, maybe it's because they're considering a private reproof. But if I go to the meeting and I'm obviously pregnant, people are then going to know what happened. Even though it was a rape, people are going to assume that it was, me being naughty or whatever. So I thought to myself, maybe they want to know. So if I say I'm not pregnant, they can reprove me privately. So I said, I'm not pregnant. No, I'm not. And then the brother who asked me, he was completely stony-faced and kind of hostile, and he said, how do you know? And I said, because I know. I know I'm not pregnant. That should have sufficed. He, by law, should not go any further than that. That is invasive to even say that to a woman. How do you know? What do you expect the answer's going to be? And in the end, they kept pressing me and saying, yes, but you have to prove it to us that you're not pregnant. I almost felt like saying, do you want to put your head up my skirt and have a look? Because I feel like that's what you're kind of angling towards. You want to know intimate details, which I, by law, shouldn't have to tell 3 men. And in the end, I said to them, I have had a period since I came home. And they all nodded, and I could feel the pressure lifted, and they all started to write down in their little notebooks, and they continued. And I felt so degraded and violated, even more so by them, that I knew that talking about being raped, because I didn't tell them that part by then, I thought there was no point. They don't care. They are hostile and invasive enough. They're making me feel terrible already. I already feel sick from this, and we've only just started. I knew that there would be no sympathy, no delicacy, no concern for me at all. I knew it would just be like these sledgehammer questions and peeking up your skirt. And the second they get you into that room, into that judicial committee, you are no longer a person with rights. You are now just a thing. And they are in control of your life. And they can tell you whether they're going to give your life back or they're taking it away. From that point on, you have no basic rights. You don't have a right to privacy or security or comfort or anything else. You have no rights at all. And it's a terrible culture. And I want to make this podcast because I do want people to understand the dirty side of this religion, because you can't become a Jehovah's Witness and think that you are making an informed decision if you've only been told the good side of this religion, and that you are falsely led to believe that disfellowshipping only happens in the most severe of circumstances. That is not the case. People have been disfellowshipped for less than me, much less. So people need to know this kind of thing. So if you are Jehovah's Witness and listening to this, first of all, naughty you, because you know you shouldn't be listening to this kind of thing, but here you are anyway. Here comes the fear, obligation and guilt. Please don't give in to that nonsense and rethink the way you're thinking. And if you're not a Jehovah's Witness but you're studying or you're interested, please understand that you need to make an informed decision. If you listen to everything I'm saying and the witnesses and you still want to become a witness, then good for you. Do it. You need to be able to enter that kind of contract, because they told me that when you get baptized and you declare in front of an audience that you want to be one of Jehovah's Witnesses, that is a legally binding oral contract. And if you make a legally binding oral contract, you need to know every aspect of it before you make that commitment, because it is a lifelong commitment. And the consequences of saying no or changing your mind or whatever, they are devastating. They have long-lasting impacts upon your mental health and your relationships with other people. It can screw you up for the rest of your life. So you better understand, for real, everything that you're committing to. But anyways, I hope people enjoyed this podcast, and stay tuned for more. And please leave comments or whatever, and let me know your thoughts, whether you agree or disagree. I'd like to hear both sides. So thank you, and peace out.